All right, welcome once again to Questioning Christianity with Rob Helton and Dan McClellan. I'm Dan, and Rob is sitting across from the dining room table here with me at our studios in Huntersville, North Carolina. It's also the place where I sleep at night. Rob is a pastor. He's a student of Scripture. I think I've said this before, he's an all-around good guy.
You have said that before, but I don't think you can say that too much, personally.
Well, I stand by it. I stand firmly by it. We appreciate you guys tuning in to Questioning Christianity. This is a show for, I think it's a show for folks like us who grow up here in the Bible Belt. And it's a show that's not afraid to ask and try to answer the tough questions. And we present some answers, but we also recognize that there's always room for disagreement. And the show kind of works like this. I ask a lot of questions, and Rob answers the questions.
That's not the way the show actually works.
I was trying to throw a new format at you. Now, we just explore some things together and sit around the table and talk about some things that I feel like need to be talked about. So, Rob, what is new with you?
We had a good weekend this past weekend. My wife and I were able to go back down east where I pastored a church there for about 10 years in a little town called Havelock. Shout out to all my Havelock friends. And they celebrated their homecoming, which is, I guess it's the birthday of the church, their annual celebration. And so it was a blast. I'm really, really tired, and I can't put one sentence or two sentences together. See, I can't even put one sentence together.
So does that mean you go to Havelock before every show? Ha ha! See what I did?
Yeah, you made it funny.
I did. It was awesome. And I can tell by Google Analytics that we have a lot of listeners in the Havelock area.
Really?
Nah, I don't. So you can find out a little bit more about our show at a couple of places. We do have a website. It's questioningchristianitypodcast.com. But we always point you to Facebook, facebook.com/questioningchristianity. And there you will find links to our blog, to our website. And that's a good way to give us some feedback and submit your own questions. But we have something brand new this week. We have a phone number.
Yes. I'm really excited about that.
So, I mean, the technology that's available
I know.
is amazing.
It is amazing.
So if you would like to hear your voice on next week's podcast, you can call this number and leave us a message. The number is 704-709-9736, 704-709-9736. And again, that number is posted on our website and on Facebook. But call that number, leave us a message, and that message could be a question that you'd like to ask. It could be a comment, a criticism about the show, whatever you'd like to share with us, and we'll play it next week as part of the show.
Sounds good.
So, Rob, what we want to do the next couple of weeks, or at least for the next 3 shows, is talk a little about the cross and what that really means. And before we started recording, you asked a question that really kind of got my attention, and that was, why is Jesus's, or how do you say that, Jesus? How is Jesus's?
You can do it either way, Dan.
Okay.
Either way is grammatically correct.
Really? All right, well, I'm going to go with Jesus's.
Okay.
Because it sounds funny. What was significant about Jesus's crucifixion? There were a lot of people that were crucified back in that time period. So what we want to do over the next 3 weeks is try to understand a little bit more about what that significance is. And so there are some theories or doctrines, and Rob, you can tell us a little bit more about some of these, but the 3 that we're going to focus on over the next 3 episodes is substitutionary atonement, Christus Victor atonement, and today we're going to talk about moral influence doctrine. So if you want to do some Google searching and find out a little bit more about next week's show and the week after, that's substitutionary atonement and Christus Victor atonement. But today we're on moral influence doctrine. So, Rob, what in the world does that mean?
Well, we're going to talk about the cross of Christ as the example or the pattern for all followers of Jesus. But before we do that, if I may, Dan, let me back up just a little bit, just to add a little bit to your introduction of the series, because I do force myself to rethink the whole concept of the cross of Jesus Christ. There are literally hundreds of questions, I think, that can be asked around this. Why the cross? And what is significant about one Jewish rabbi who lived 2,000 years ago, who never traveled more than 100 miles from the place of his birth? He didn't leave us any writings like some of the other prophets did. He was crucified as a criminal, and his crucifixion was carried out by the Roman government with the endorsement of the Jewish religious leadership. So he had virtually nobody on his side when he was crucified. And on top of that, he was one of thousands of others who were crucified by Rome. The historian Josephus tells us that in one town, and not far from where Jesus grew up, in a town called Sepphoris, Rome crucified 2,000 Jews in a day. So why did this one crucifixion of one obscure Jewish rabbi not just fade into history? Why, 2,000 years later, are we still talking about it? At least I would argue that there must be something significant about this for us to be having this conversation this evening, Dan.
Yeah, and I think in a lot of ways, we are still trying to figure out the significance of the crucifixion. So we can almost put ourselves in the shoes of the disciples and of his family and the folks that experienced that firsthand. They had the trust that this was the Son of God, the Messiah, and it didn't kind of go down the way everyone planned.
Yeah, and maybe it's good that, as you said, we're still trying to figure it out, because I believe that the cross is a deep mystery, and it's beyond our figuring out. And maybe if we could figure it out, then it wouldn't be as powerful as we believe that it is.
Well, and then some scholars have attempted to figure it out, and that's where we get into some of these doctrines and theories. Yeah. And so we'll kind of use them, I guess, as the start of our conversation, and then explore and see what the Bible has to say about it and what your study has to say about it. And I think this first one, moral influence, is kind of an interesting one in that it puts the crucifixion, or it's very much related to how we live. And so it's affecting us today, this moral influence doctrine. Mm-hmm. So tell us a little bit more about this one.
Let me start with a passage of Scripture that is at least one passage that this particular understanding of the cross grows out of. One of the earliest followers of Jesus was a man named Peter, and there are a couple of letters that are in his name. Some say that it was Peter who wrote, and others say that it was one of his disciples. I think either way, the content of these letters share what is at the heart of the followers of Jesus, what was central to their thinking. But in this first letter that Peter wrote, he is encouraging some followers of Jesus to live lives that are worthy of that name. If you have your Bibles, I want you to open them up, if you would, to 1 Peter chapter 2. And he starts off this way. He says, "Slaves," addressing slaves, "in reverent fear of God, submit yourselves to your masters, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh." Just to pause here and remind you guys, I know you know this, but I think when we read a passage in the Bible like this, we need to be reminded that Christianity is one of the most influential forces throughout the centuries for the abolishment of slavery, to call attention to the wrongfulness, the evil of slavery, and to say that all people are free in Christ. And Peter is is not denying that. He's simply saying that while you are living where you are, then in that capacity, these people happen to be slaves. In that capacity, then you need to live as followers of Jesus should live. He goes on to say, it's commendable if someone bears up under the pain of unjust suffering because they are conscious of God. But how is it to your credit if you receive a beating for doing wrong and endure it? But if you suffer for doing good and you endure it, it is commendable before God. It's not a big deal to suffer for doing something that you should suffer for, but if you suffer because you're doing the thing that you should do, then that's commendable. To this you were called because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an, as our word, example, that you should follow in his steps. He committed no sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. When they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. As he has that conversation, he says, for to this you have been called. Okay, so in other words, this is your calling. Because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. So Peter is saying, you are called as a follower of Christ to endure suffering because Christ suffered for you. And then he uses this word. He said, he left you an example that you should follow in his steps. So the moral influence theory or the example theory is the idea that we should pattern our lives after the way that Jesus actually lived, and that Jesus is our pattern. In fact, this word example is a word from the education world. The Greek word is hypogrammos. It's where we get, part of it is where we get our word grammatical. Mm-hmm. And it's actually, by the way, only used here in the New Testament. This is the only place that it's used. But it was a technical term for a little tool that was used to help kids learn to form their letters. I don't know if you used those pads, those writing pads, when you were in kindergarten, Dan, where they had the lines on it.
3 lines and the dotted line in the middle.
Exactly, yeah. And then there's an example letter that is literally your pattern. You're supposed to look at that letter, and then right beside of it, you're supposed to form that letter as closely as you can by that pattern.
Oh, yeah. And sometimes they even have it kind of a dotted version of the letter that you can trace over.
There you go. Okay. Exactly. Well, that's the word that's being used here. Now, they probably didn't have the exact same tool, but it was a tool to do the very same thing that we're talking about. So Jesus is the pattern. He is the standard that we are supposed to look at, and then we are to form our lives in every way after the pattern that he gives for us. Now, that covers a lot of ground. Peter specifically mentions here, part of that pattern is the suffering of Jesus. So followers of Jesus are called to suffer like Jesus.
It makes sense that we would be called to live our lives like Jesus did. He went around, he helped people, he taught, he healed people, he ignored the racism of the day. Why does Peter focus on what seems like the darkest moment of his life, his crucifixion?
Yeah.
And why is suffering, of all the wonderful things Jesus did, why is suffering need to be called out as something that we really need to join him in?
Yeah, well, I throw that out there, and I think actually Peter threw it out there not because he's masochistic or he's inviting people to be. I believe that Peter is, in a moment, he's taking his readers to the farthest extent of what it means to follow Jesus.
Okay.
Which is, in some form, suffering. Now, I totally agree with what you said. When we talk about this idea of suffering, it's a turnoff, not just because nobody wants to suffer, but because it doesn't make an awful lot of good logical sense to who in their right mind would seek out suffering. And I don't think that that's what Peter is inviting. He's not inviting them to just go suffer just to be suffering. He's not inviting them to impose some kind of self-inflicted pain just to do it. What Peter knows, though, as a follower of Jesus, is that when we follow Jesus and we're committed to that, there is some suffering that we're going to endure that, to our surprise, actually becomes one of the most redemptive elements of our life. And Peter is inviting these people who he's writing to, these fledgling Christians who are trying their best to follow Jesus, he's inviting them to step into that, not to be afraid to go ahead and step into it, because he believes that, to their surprise, that when they embrace that suffering, that they're going to discover that even that suffering is something that is redemptive and a part of Jesus in their lives.
So what do we know about the audience of these letters? Were they facing some type of threat? Was Peter preparing them for suffering that was to come? Or were they doing something kind of selfishly so that they weren't suffering? Do we know anything about the original audience and what they might have understood this letter to say to them?
Yeah, a little bit. We don't know exactly what kind of suffering that the recipients of the letter are going through, but they are enduring some kind of persecution. They are people who were Gentile converts to Christianity. Their suffering could have been coming from Jewish Christians. Some Jewish Christians believe that Gentiles could be Christians, but they wanted them to become Jews first.
Yeah.
And the persecution could be coming from Jews. It could be coming from, a number of different sources. But they are going through persecution. We can determine that. And Peter is, I guess, helping them connect that persecution with the idea of being a follower of Jesus and being like Jesus.
So when we think about the death of Jesus on the cross, this example that was set for us, we think about it in this way. This is one of the ways that we understand what happened on the cross, that Jesus was setting for us an example, Peter says, and that we are to live according to that example. As he suffered on the cross, we are to embrace that as the way that we are to function in this world as followers of Jesus. It's our pattern. We use it to shape and form our lives after Jesus. From Luke chapter 9, Jesus said, "The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and teachers of the law, and he must be killed on the third day and be raised to life." And then he said to them all, "If anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me." In fact, in all three of the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus says this. In fact, several places he says this. If you're going to follow me, if you're going to come after me, you have to deny yourself, you have to take up your cross, and you have to let me be your pattern. Peter said you have to walk in his steps like a little child puts his feet in the footprints that his father left. We follow in his steps, and we embrace all that Jesus taught us through his life and through his death. And that means that we embrace a life of serving and sacrificing and suffering. We embrace a kind of death in ourselves on behalf of others. In different ways, we give up ourselves to follow the example of Jesus. And by doing so, we not only experience a deeper, a more meaningful, what the Bible calls an eternal life ourselves, but somehow we open up that door to the people that we give ourselves to.
When we take this instruction seriously, and when we take this understanding of the cross of Jesus seriously, that the cross of Jesus is our pattern, that Jesus is our pattern, then it's going to very naturally lead to suffering. It won't be probably not like Christians endured 2,000 years ago. But as we step into the way of Jesus, that intrinsic to that way is some kind of sacrificial suffering. Suffering is, I guess, kind of a harsh word. But let me give you, maybe it'll help if I give you an example.
Sure.
Dan. Mother Teresa. Most everybody knows about Mother Teresa, and she's a beloved figure. But she was a nun, and for many, many years, she served the poor of Calcutta, India. One of the stories about Mother Teresa is that as she was growing older, later in life, her feet became deformed. And they were deformed to the point that she endured pain and suffering every day because of the deformity of her feet. Her closest friends, the other nuns, knew this, but it became public knowledge later on that the reason that Mother Teresa's feet were deformed is because when the shoes that were donated to the orphanages and the people who needed them would come in, Mother Teresa would make sure that everybody got the best pair of shoes possible. She would pass out these shoes, and what she would end up wearing would be kind of the worst pair of shoes. And somehow it always ended up being a pair of shoes that were too small or that were in some way bad for her feet. It was kind of like people who sometimes, people don't always donate the very best of stuff. And Mother Teresa would take the leftovers and she'd give the best away. Well, consequently, she suffered because her feet became deformed. Now, I would say that's an example of the suffering of Christ. Mother Teresa wasn't trying to suffer. She wasn't looking to be a sufferer. She was looking to follow Jesus. In that moment, when she's sorting through those shoes, what's going on through her mind, probably not even consciously, but subconsciously, because it had become second nature to her, what's going on in her mind is, which pair of shoes would Jesus wear? Yeah. And so in her pursuit of the heart of Jesus, it leads her to wear a pair of shoes that hurt her feet. And then down the road, she suffers. Now, that may sound far-fetched to some people, and some people may hear that and say, that's ridiculous. I would never do that. I'm just trying to argue or make the point that this is one example of the way a human being actually endured some kind of suffering because their heart was drawn to Jesus. They were chasing after, they were pursuing Jesus.
What if you feel like you're not suffering? What does that mean? So take me, for example. I work a job. I have a family. I like to play music. I like to watch movies. I'm not really suffering, although I'd like to think that I'm trying to live into the life that Jesus wants for me.
Yeah. Well,
am I neglecting something?
Well, no, not necessarily. In all honesty, I think that there are ways of patterning our lives that can shield us from something that we need to step into. And we just need to be sensitive to that. And I'm not saying that every example of suffering will be harsh physical suffering.
Okay. Yeah.
What I am saying is that the life of a Christ follower is, by its very nature, in some way, sacrificial, which is another word for, in some way, suffering. If I'm following Jesus, and in the process of that, I live a comfortable life, but I sense that if I'm going to follow the way of Jesus, then I need to be a generous person. And so I decide I'm going to support good causes that are redemptive in our world. So, for instance, one that comes to mind is an organization called Compassion International. And for a certain monthly amount, I think it's $38 now, and I guess I'm doing a commercial for Compassion International now, but you can give a child in a third world country all the resources that child needs to have their medical care provided, basic hygiene, nutrition, and education. Okay, so if I do that for one child, well, then I'm sacrificing $40 that I could spend on fly fishing material. Now that's suffering. Yeah. That's sacrificing. I bet
$40 doesn't go very far with fly fishing materials.
No, Compassion International can do a whole lot more with $40 than I can. $40 will buy some guitar strings, or And if I support two kids that way, well, then that's a little bit more than I'm having to give up because I'm chasing after the heart of Jesus. Not because I'm trying to be a good person or because I'm guilted into it. I'm not one of these TV evangelists, by the way. Please don't. I need to make this disclaimer. I'm not one of these guys who gets on television and says, "Now, just send us in this money and we'll send you this gift Bible or whatever."
But it is weird that you wear so much makeup.
I know, just for a podcast. Yeah. That is weird. That may be some reason besides. No, let's not even go there.
All right, fair enough.
At any rate, if I begin to live into this way of Jesus, then in some way I'm going to be called to this kind of sacrificial life. And why? Why would I be called to it? Well, because Jesus is the pattern. And Jesus gave himself up in every way. Think about the incarnation. God became flesh. He became a human being and took on all the pain and suffering that goes with being a human being. As a human being, Jesus was a poor individual, and he suffered poverty. And of course, ultimately, the pattern that we're talking about is the way he gave himself up sacrificially on the cross. Does that mean that in the 21st century that if you're a follower of Jesus, you got to hang yourself on a cross? No. But it does mean that if we take Jesus seriously, that in some way it will cost. It will cost. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a German theologian in World War II, who stood against Nazi Germany and eventually was hung because of his stance. He was in the minority, by the way. Most of the German pastors endorsed Hitler, but Bonhoeffer and a few others stood against Hitler, and he suffered. Bonhoeffer wrote a book called The Cost of Discipleship, which is a good book if you can get it. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, The Cost of Discipleship. And he tries to make this argument that intrinsic to being a disciple of Jesus Christ, there is a cost. And it's not that you're trying to do that to earn your salvation. We don't believe that. It's not that you're trying to do it to even make yourself feel better about yourself. You're doing it because Jesus is your pattern. And whatever Jesus does, you're going to try to pattern yourself after him.
You're listening to Questioning Christianity with Rob Helton and Dan McClellan. I want to encourage you to send in your questions, your comments, and criticisms. Start off at facebook.com/questioningchristianity. And as I mentioned at the start of the show, we do have a brand new phone number that you can call and leave a message, and so that way we can play the audio as part of next week's show. That phone number is 704-709-9736, 704-709-9736. So, Rob, Peter is writing, and he's reminding us or instructing us to follow Jesus into suffering, even to death on a cross. Christ himself told his disciples and the people that were listening to him to take up their cross and follow him. And I always found that to be kind of a weird, why didn't someone say, hey, wait a second, what are you talking about? What would the audience that heard Jesus say that, what would they have thought about him saying, take up your cross. I guess it seems like it would be one of those things that makes sense maybe to them later, but it's an odd thing to tell someone, hey, take up your cross and follow me.
Yeah, and that's a really good question, and I don't know that we can answer it too definitively.
Okay.
But I believe that chances are that, like a lot of other things that Jesus said, what he said and what he meant by what he said and what they heard were two different things. I think that what Jesus meant by that was exactly what we're talking about. Jesus was saying to his disciples, I am the Messiah that has come into this world, and the way that my followers will follow me will be literally through their own suffering, which proved to be absolutely true. Tradition tells us that Peter was also crucified, and tradition tells us that he was so humble and so respectful of Jesus that he asked his executioners if they would crucify him upside down, because he was not worthy to be crucified in the like manner as his Savior was crucified.
Wow. Yeah, I've heard that before.
So Peter literally took up his cross and followed Jesus.
Followed the pattern.
Exactly, followed the pattern. Now, the disciples may have heard Jesus say, I'm the Messiah, and if you're going to follow me and we go to war with Rome, some of you will be crucified, and you may have to die on a cross. Now, they may have heard him say that.
Okay.
I'm just saying, if I had been one of his disciples, putting myself in their shoes, that's probably what I would have heard, because there were a lot of Messiah figures who came and went around the same time that Jesus was conducting his ministry. And all of them were calling on their followers to take up not crosses, but swords and to follow them. But many of them did die on crosses because of their willingness to follow that particular Messiah. And so the disciples may have been what they were hearing Jesus say, but that was not what Jesus was saying.
Gotcha. And one of the things we're going to get into, I think, next week's show and the week after is why the crucifixion was part of God's plan. And so that's something to look forward to on upcoming episodes. Before we get into a couple of questions that were submitted this week, any final thoughts? Anything that we didn't get to? We're talking about the moral influence doctrine.
Well, I just want to point out that the church has, throughout 2,000 years of history, the church has done well at times with this particular understanding of the cross, and they have used Jesus as their pattern, and they have suffered. And in those times of suffering, they themselves have been more influential than at any other time during their history. The times that we haven't taken that seriously, our influence has, we haven't had any influence.
Can you give an example of what you mean by that?
Historically, the first 4 centuries of Christianity, up until the early 300s, 325, Christians were persecuted. It wasn't a constant persecution, but it kind of came in waves. They were persecuted early on by some Jewish people. Later on, they were persecuted by Rome. A famous persecution is Nero, who did all kind of atrocities to the Christians. Ironically, Christianity grew exponentially during those 400 years. People were drawn to Christianity, partly because Christians were, in following the pattern of Jesus, their love for their neighbors, for their fellow human beings, was irresistible. And so Christianity grew. Well, along came Constantine, who, the legend goes, had a vision of a cross, and he heard a voice say, "Do battle under the cross." And Constantine converted to Christianity, and he started doing battle under the cross as a Christian. Well, I don't believe that Constantine heard a voice saying, do battle under the cross. But the point is that Constantine officially converted to Christianity. Eventually, he made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. He took Christian leaders into his fold, and he gave them power, he gave them prestige, he gave them money. And suddenly, Christians moved from suffering and being excluded and on the outside to being on the inside. And eventually they become the ones who impose suffering on others. Right. Later on, the Christian Crusades, where they sent, and literally they fought under the cross. They had a sign of the cross on their swords and on their shields, and they killed other human beings, which was as far removed from the heart of Jesus as you could possibly be. Ironically, though, when they got the endorsement and the blessing of the state, then they lost their influence. And Christianity went into what we call the Dark Ages. I can take that a step further and say I think that there are lots and lots and lots of similarities to our world today.
I think you can see that different parts of the world are kind of experiencing those extreme conditions, more where they're out, like maybe in China, where you have underground kind of Christianity, and then here where it's still it's not the official religion of the American government, but it's certainly not persecuted.
Well, I think you're making a really good point, Dan, because some of the places that you're talking about, not as much now, but for many, many years, China under communism, the Christians had to go underground. Well, we didn't really know what was happening with Christianity in China for many, many years, about 50 years. Lo and behold, when that persecution eased up a little bit, what we found out was that Christianity had exploded underground in China. China is one of the places where Christianity has grown the fastest over the last while. In Asia, in Africa, Christianity, even now, is growing exponentially. Christianity is, by the way, the fastest growing religion, or I should say, I don't know, that religion has some connotations to it that maybe are not the best, but Christianity is growing faster than any other faith in the world, but it's not here. In North America, Christianity is declining, and it's declining rapidly. I read a little bit of an article the other day from a publication called The Christian Post, and that writer, I can't endorse his statistics, but he says that every day, 3,500 people leave the Christian faith in this country. We know that every year, 3,000 to 5,000 churches close their doors in this country. Now, I guess we could debate why that is. And here's the argument that I would make. I would say that 21st century America looks an awful lot like 4th century Rome. That American Christians have been lulled into this state of wanting power, political power. Evangelical Christians now are best known as a voting bloc, not as a Jesus movement. Instead of seeking to follow the way of Jesus and humbly stepping into sacrificial service and suffering, we've sought to control Washington and to force our way kind of on people. And it has not worked for us, and it is not working for us. Now, I may get some pushback for that because my opinion is not the same as a lot of other people's. But the fact is that Christianity is declining in North America.
And so to tie it back to this moral influence doctrine and the pattern that Jesus provides, it seems that the church or Christianity, when they are embracing or when they are following that pattern, it's much more influential than when they kind of get away from it.
Yeah, I think history proves that out.
Largely, Christendom represented a radical movement away from the Jesus pattern. What I would also say is that there's still some residue of Christendom around in our world today. Now, our forefathers planted a beautiful seed, I think, what we might call the post-Christendom seed. And over the years, that tree has been growing steadily, slowly. And I think in our world today, in the 21st century, what we're seeing is that the buds on that post-Christendom tree are beginning to form, and we're beginning to see this wonderful, beautiful image of the church that's going back to the Jesus pattern. those buds are beginning to open up, and the church is looking like Jesus as it hasn't looked like Jesus in a long, long time. There is a post-Christendom movement sweeping across our world right now, whether you know it or not. The 21st century church promises to look more like the first century church than any other century down through the ages of the church. But right now, I believe with all my heart that we stand at an opportune time in the life of the church. We stand at a threshold where we have this beautiful, beautiful opportunity lying before us for the church to once again fully embrace the Jesus pattern. For the church to be thought of as a movement more than an institution.
This is Questioning Christianity. We want to hear from you. We get some questions on our website, which is questioningchristianitypodcast.com. It's very long to type. So sometimes we encourage folks to go to facebook.com/questioningchristianity. We get questions submitted there, either through the Messenger app or directly to our posts. And now you can also submit some questions on our listener feedback line at 704-709-9736, 704-709-9736. You just call. It's a voicemail account. Leave your name and your question or your comment or criticism, whatever you'd like to share with us, and we'll play it as part of next week's show. So, Rob, we got two questions we want to get to before we hit the final music today. One was in response to last week's show where we were talking about God's love and God's wrath. To summarize real quickly what we talked about last week, we experience the natural consequences of our bad decisions, and we also said that God lovingly corrects us in an attempt to improve, our growth or our well-being. Mm-hmm. How do you know when you're being disciplined? And the question came in was something to this effect that I got a bad diagnosis this week. Is that God's wrath? Am I being disciplined? How are we to make sense of circumstance and God's will and all this stuff?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I don't know that there's an easy answer, and I'm not sure that I'm trying to offer an answer. What I would say is, I encourage people to not make the idea that God is disciplining me their knee-jerk reaction. A lot of times, for some folks, especially people who grew up in the same kind of religious culture that I grew up in, anytime anything bad happens, we have to attribute it either to God or Satan, one or the other. And sometimes maybe both of those are take us down the wrong road. The reality is we live in a world that is broken, as we talked about on a podcast not too long ago about human suffering. Things in our world are not as they once were, or according to our faith, how they will be someday. And so I would encourage you not to automatically think, well, I'm being disciplined by God. Here's the other point that I would make, or the other suggestion that I would make. Christians are people who are called to live in community. And our discernment does not come out of what we can figure out on our own. We always operate within a community of other followers of Jesus, and we take our experiences, particularly our questions, to that community, and we share it with that community. It may be a small group of people that you meet with, a Bible study, a Sunday school class, a home group. And if you're puzzled about something, then ask your community to prayerfully consider it and to give you feedback. Now, there may be something that you're going through in your life that's pretty obvious to your community that is a wrong turn on your part, and you're suffering some consequences that you may not see. And the benefit of having a community is that they'll see that for you.
Makes sense. The second question comes from me, actually. I just thought about it when you were talking earlier. I think you said something about Jesus, we don't have any writings from Jesus. And I'm wondering why that is. A guy who communicated so eloquently through speech and sermons, why is there nothing written by Jesus?
I have no idea. But I guess one theory that I've heard is that anything that we could trace back to Jesus in that way, anything that would have his name on it, like, for instance, one of the letters of the Apostle Paul or something, would eventually, I think, become kind of an idol for us. And we would, rather than seek after the person of Jesus, this mystical Christ, that lives and breathes and dwells with us now, we would turn those words on a piece of parchment into some kind of an idol. And to be honest with you, we've kind of done that with the Bible anyway, and practice bibliolatry instead of Christianity sometimes. But we have to keep bringing people back to Jesus. Now, I guess if there's anything dogmatic about this podcast, at least for my part, I would say we must keep bringing people back to the person of Jesus, I believe.
And that is where we're going to wrap it up for today. We'll continue our conversations on next week's podcast about the crucifixion and the cross and what the significance of that event means for us. So for Rob Helton, I'm Dan McClellan. Thanks again for listening to Questioning Christianity. Please send us some questions this week. Head to facebook.com/questioning Christianity. And we'd appreciate your help in sharing the podcast as well. So we'll talk to you next week.